So this past week, my producer and I drove up the East Coast to meet and interview three pretty legendary figures in Australian surf filmmaking and journalism. These men have been instrumental in shaping the image of Bali in Australia over the past 50 years, so when we began working on our film, speaking with them felt like the best place to start. And I wanted to talk a bit about our processes and the thinking behind how we're shaping our story.
No, these were films. These were glass slides shown from the projection room to the audience.
Most media about Bali tends to focus on a single aspect of the island. Eat, Pray, Love emphasised a slower, more spiritual version of Bali, while news coverage has often centred on the darker moments like the Bali bombings. Other films have explored events such as the Bali 9 and particularly the global reaction that followed the executions. But Bali's history is far richer and more complex than any one story. Our aim is to explore how this idea of paradise has endured despite what has been an intense history of outside influence, and in doing so, shed a light on the island, maybe one that encourages tourists and travellers to approach Bali with a deeper sense of awareness. So the project is led by our producer Zan, who you'll see throughout some of the footage here. Zan is half Indonesian and half Australian, which in many ways mirrors the very relationship that this film explores. His familial connection to Indonesia gives him a personal link to the culture, whilst growing up in Australia means he's also part of the audience that has consumed the myth of Bali for decades. We've also learned that Bali means something completely different depending on who it is you ask. For some, it's a spiritual centre. For others, it's a surf paradise, and for many, simply a holiday destination. Those early perceptions were shaped in part by the three men we travelled to interview. Our first stop was Nusa, where we met surf journalist Phil Jarratt. Phil has spent decades documenting surf culture as it grew from a small counterculture into a global industry, whilst also capturing the period when Australians first began travelling to Indonesia in large numbers. He spent significant time in Bali since his first trip in 1974, and he wrote extensively about the island for Tracks magazine and Australian newspapers. In 2014, he published Bali, Heaven and Hell, a detailed account of the island's history from its belief systems to the impact of tourism. That book played a big role in convincing Zan this film could exist at all. Phil likely has one of the deepest understandings of Bali of any non-Balinese person, and on top of that, he was incredibly supportive of what we were trying to do. From Nusa, we drove south to Byron Bay where we met Dick Hoole. Dick began as a photographer before moving into filmmaking, eventually working alongside Jack McCoy to create some of the most iconic surf films from the 70s and the 80s. Two in particular, Tubular Swells and Storm Riders, stand out, both of which feature primarily Australian seascapes, which makes the sequences that are shot in Bali and Indonesia feel even more special. Dick shared stories about filming in that era and how dramatically Bali has changed over time. He lives about 30 minutes inland from Byron Bay on a steep hill surrounded by open paddocks. And when we arrived, we were greeted by about 18 sheep, which made for some pretty unique opening shots. Now, partly because we were travelling up the coast and partly because of the spaces we found ourselves in, we decided to shoot most of these interviews using just natural light. Phil's living room in Nusa was already full of windowed daylight, so we leaned into that as much as we were also forced into it. Dick's place in the hills outside Byron Bay felt very connected to the land around it, and the overcast daylight at the time gave everything a natural softness. Inside Dick's house, it felt like stepping into a time capsule. The walls were filled with relics from his life in surfing. In the basement, he had stacks of his original 16mm reels along with posters, archives, and a huge collection of surf films. It felt less like a house and more like a museum. There was something undeniable about seeing so much of Dick's work stored physically. Stacks of reels, boxes of film, decades of history you could actually hold in your hands. And despite Dick's frustration with the limitations of film, he described how after loading his camera into the water housing, he'd only get about 16 seconds of footage before he had to swim ashore and reload. But it made us realise how important it is to preserve these analogue formats. So our final stop was meeting Albert Falzon. Albie is one of the key figures who helped move surfing from a small subculture into something that's more embedded in the mainstream Australian culture. Alongside Dave Elphick and John Witzig, he co-founded Tracks magazine, and he later created Morning of the Earth, which is one of the most influential surf films ever made. Released in the 1970s, the film didn't just show surfing, it captured an entire lifestyle. Both Phil and Dick credit it as one of the reasons they and many others eventually travelled to Bali. Before meeting him, we'd already built quite a strong idea of who we thought Albie might be, shaped by our research and also what Dick and Phil had said. I remember Dick telling us, just wait until you boys meet Albie on Albie Land. The place was filled with surfboards, paintings and photographs, each carrying its own story. At one point, he showed us a book he'd put together documenting the evolution of his property over the years. If Dick's house felt like a museum, Albie Land felt more like a personal archive. This road trip marked the beginning of our documentary, and it gave us something incredibly valuable. It gave us context, and it gave us a better understanding of how Bali entered the Australian imagination, and why it still means so much to so many people today. Of course, these men aren't the only ones who shaped that perception, but their stories are an important part of it. They're just one thread in the much larger tapestry that's often called paradise.